Parashat Bo, we hear about the performance of the first Korban Pesach, the first of the Paschal offerings that eventually becomes a mitzvah in the Torah, a commandment in the Torah for all time. But in its first instance, it's happening at the moment when Bnei Israel are leaving Mitzrayim, when they're beginning the exodus from Egypt, and it's at this moment when Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to strike the firstborn of Egypt and break the will of Pharaohs so that he will finally agree to let Bnei Israel go free to serve Hashem. And really, this moment is referred to in various ways before it actually happens. First of all, because at the very beginning of this whole encounter with Pharaoh, Kadosh Baruch Hu says to him, Beni Bichuri Israel, Israel is my firstborn, and if you don't let them go, then I will strike your firstborn. But there's another aspect that I want to emphasize, which in various forms you might argue appears more than once, which is about the nature of the request to let Bnei Israel go. It's not just that they have to go free, it's that they have to go free to serve Hashem. Shlach et ami ve'ya'avduni, set my people free so that they may serve me. And then that service specifically has to do actually with sacrifices of animals, which becomes clear at the point where Paro says, okay, you can go. And then Moshe says, all right, but we're taking our livestock so that we can perform sacrifices. And then it becomes a point of contention. And then we get the striking of the firstborn as the final blow. But earlier on, Moshe says, so we have, Vayomer Moshe, lo nachon la'asot ken, כי תועבת מצרים נזבח לאדוני אלוהינו, הנזבח את תועבת מצרים לעיניהם ולא יסכלונו. So Moshe is explaining to Paro. Paro had said, why don't you just sacrifice in the land? Why do you have to leave? ויקרא פרעה אל משה ולאהרון ויאמר לכו זבחו לאלוהיהם בארץ. So go and sacrifice to your God in the land. And Moshe says, no, it's not proper to do so. We'll sacrifice to Hashem our God that which is an abomination to the Egyptians, to the Mitzrayim. And how are we to sacrifice such an abomination to the Egyptians without their stoning us, right? And the abomination that he's referring to, as we come to understand, is that they're going to have to sacrifice a lamb. And there's this whole thing with shepherds and sheep with Mitzrayim that gets referred to as various points. They can't eat with shepherds, and we learn from these passages that slaughtering sheep in the presence of Mitzrayim would cause some kind of mob violence because of what an abomination would be according to their beliefs, somehow according to their the structure of their idolatry. There's something sacred or protected or at least inappropriate about slaughtering sheep in a normal public setting. So we have this idea that slaughtering sheep is an unacceptable ritual act to perform in the presence of the Egyptians, that it defiles their gods somehow, that it's a form of blasphemy, a form of religious rebellion to do so. And isn't it interesting that the ultimate moment of being set free by Paro after the striking of the firstborn is earned essentially by this act of rebellion by Bnei Israel, that they ultimately do perform Korban Pesach, the Paschal sacrifice. They slaughter a lamb, they take the blood and dip in the blood the ezov, which is a plant, hyssop, which they then use to paint the blood on their doorposts and on their lintel, the mashkof and the mezuzot, and they stay inside, and the striking of the firstborn takes place. Right? So the slaughtering of the lamb by Bnei Israel is this culminating moment where they earn the protection that through which they will survive the striking of the firstborn, and which will ultimately then lead to their liberation, which they have so long yearned for. And I think one of the things we can get out of this, because there's clearly many possibilities, is going to come from stepping back and recognizing that Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim, right? The occurrences in the lives of our forefathers are signs for us. This is a formula of the Ramban, I believe, but which really you see in various versions throughout the Torah, that there's more than one thing that happens in the Torah that kind of resembles archetypal narrative moments that recur. So, although it's the case that, for example, this is the explicit description of the Exodus from Egypt, Yetziat Mitzrayim, it's also the case that when Avram and Sarai go down to Egypt, that Sarai is taken captive, that there are sort of plagues or blows of some kinds that strike Paro, and he sets Sarai free, and Avram and Sarai leave with wealth. So there's a kind of miniature version of Yetziat Mitzrayim that happens generations earlier. And part of what that's showing us is that the Torah is not just talking about the past. In a sense, it's really giving a provocative retelling of the past in order to sensitize us to what is possible in our present and our future, and what's going to recur over and over again in varied forms, not so that it's always identical and fated, but so that we can use the models of the human condition provided by the Torah to make better decisions about how to serve Hashem more successfully in the future as things happen over and over again as they do. So, to the degree that that's the case, we now have to ask ourselves, what could it be about what happens in Mitzrayim, what happens in Egypt, that we're reading about here with Moshe and Bnei Israel and the Korban Pesach, the Paschal sacrifice, that has to do with our present moment. And again, I think when you make especially this kind of comparison, you have to recognize that if you're going to say that this kind of thing happens over and over again, then clearly all the comparisons are going to be inexact. But you can nevertheless maybe learn something. And the question I'd like to pose is there something about the experience of the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, and the current moment it finds itself in, that we can compare to this moment where Bnei Israel are stuck in Egypt, in Mitzrayim, and they're trying to get out, and they have to make this decision about how and when to perform this Paschal sacrifice. I think that sometimes we might tend not to think that that's an appropriate comparison because we are in the land of Israel now, Baruch Hashem. This is a story seemingly about when we're slaves in Mitzrayim, and so it's more natural to make that comparison when we're talking about Bnei Israel in a moment where they're in galut somehow, in exile. They're stuck in a foreign land and being oppressed by a foreign ruler, and they're trying to get free so that they can go to Eretz Israel. So if that's the case, then the question is, how do we map this onto our present moment if we're in the land? And I think there it obviously requires a bit more abstraction. It requires us to think more in terms of the dynamics of relationships than about geography. This isn't that we're stuck outside of the land and we're trying to get to the land. It's not necessarily a state of physical servitude, but there are other kinds of servitude that are important to notice and wonder whether there are things to learn about how to get free from those as well. Because I think it has been observed by many, and rightly so, that there's a lot in the current way that politics domestically and internationally function around the state of Israel that has to do with Israel's relationship with the United States, or generally with the collection of Western countries that are loosely allied and ostensibly friends of Israel to some degree, in Europe and also in the sort of greater former British Commonwealth, but especially in the United States. I think that's a specific relationship we can look at and say there is an aspect of how Israel currently functions that is in a state of servitude, an oppressive servitude to the United States. Now, I don't want to belabor that because this obviously isn't the same thing as having to drag giant bricks around and build pyramids until you die. But this is actually a matter of life and death, and it is actually a matter of a kind of political subjugation that the state of Israel currently accepts. And others have detailed in a variety of other ways, in a variety of ways elsewhere, how this actually works. And I don't want to get into all of that. You can list the various things people talk about, how the Israeli military now needs material supplied by the US in order to function. And therefore, basically, Israel can't make independent decisions about how to deploy and operate its military, because if it does so, it might run afoul of the United States policy and then not get more interceptor rockets for Iron Dome or more armaments of other kinds, munitions that are needed for the operation of the standard weapon systems. It goes far beyond that as well. It also has to do with diplomatic cover and economic ties and all of these other things that at this point are so precious to the powers that be in Israel that in practice it's treated like, well, there are certain things we simply can't consider doing or even speak publicly about doing because that will upset the Europeans, that will upset the Americans. And if we do that, we could face economic consequences, we could lose diplomatic cover, and then have all sorts of ripple effects that have economic and other implications for security. So in practice, there are a large number of people, especially in the top brass of the army, especially in the upper echelons of any government that successfully forms in this country, that take the attitude that really we can't set independent policy about our security and about our sovereignty. We have to check certain kinds of issues with the United States. If the US says that our capital is in Jerusalem, we say thank you very much. But otherwise, we're always kind of worrying about whether that will be accepted by the world. If the US says that we can fight a war a certain way, then we'll do that. But if they tell us that we're not allowed to fight a war a certain way, then we have to listen because we don't really have a choice. We won't have the means to fight the war unless we do it, according to their rules. And that's the thing I really want to focus on right now. Is obviously the war going on in Gaza. It's well known at this point that there are a whole lot of ways in which Israel's hands have been tied in how it's been able to prosecute that war so far, because of tremendous pressure coming from the United States about how it is appropriate to fight the war. You have to constantly allow the resupply of your enemy. You can't attack the enemy in certain ways if it creates too much danger for an arbitrarily separated subset of the same population that are identified as innocent civilians. And there's this supposition that somehow there's this tiny percentage of the total number of people in this region that we're at war with who are the ones who really are fighting us, and everyone else, one may as well consider them to be completely hapless and uninvolved bystanders. And that on its own merits has to really be scrutinized and attacked. But I think in a sense, it's also beside the point, because there's also just a question of how does the Torah instruct us to conduct war? And is it actually ever the case that it's so easy to say, well, we're fighting the war against these people and this larger population that has the same education system, the same security regime, the same economic regime, the same families, the same social structure, the same religious institutions, that it's all one society. We can't actually conduct the war in such a way that we say we're at war with the whole society, and we would be suicidal to tie our hands in how we wage war when we're fighting for our own existence by claiming that the majority of people in that society are so innocent that no one can harm a hair on their head, and that we have to beat our breast and cry to the rooftops how much we regret that we are, to whatever degree that we are, succeeding in hitting the enemy where it hurts, because we have to pretend somehow that most of those hits are ones we regret or wish hadn't landed. That way of talking, that's not necessarily how the Torah teaches Am Yisrael to conduct war. It is certainly the way that the State of Israel talks about its conduct of war, and it does so out of some mixture of sincere allegiance to the foreign gods that dictate that way of conceiving of war, but also out of a great deal of perhaps less sincere, but uh, nonetheless very zealous loyalty to powers that we consider greater than us that somehow have to be pleased or have to be mollified, while this is all going on. So the idea is that even if you would say, okay, of course, we all know that actually a much larger percentage of people in Gaza were in favor of how this war began and participated in the attacks that began the war and supported and provided the sort of nourishing bosom in which, on which Hamas grew and flourished for years and years and years, right? That this is not really about a small number of people who attacked Israel from within large, indifferent, unrelated population. It's actually about a whole society that produced this point of the spear that came and hit us. But they're still holding the spear. And that way of talking about things, that's been forbidden by the Americans. And so even if you said, well, yeah, of course we know that's true, which people here often, will say, they'll say, but we can't act as though we believe that's true because the Americans say that the way you're permitted to conduct this war is you have to do everything possible to protect the quote unquote innocent. And as a result, you can't really fight the war in a way that, makes victory possible. And also you have to fight the war in a way that involves tremendous human sacrifice of your own, because so many more of your own soldiers get put in harm's way as a result of bowing to the standards that are being set by the Americans, right? So it's well known that that's the situation, how things have been going. It's bitterly sad, very frustrating, and B'ezrat Hashem, it can still change. But that's where we are now. And I think that's the aspect of subjugation and servitude that I want to focus on. The idea that Bnei Yisrael are slaves to Paro. Again, I'm not saying that means that here in Israel right now, we are somehow geographically and physically enslaved to an Egyptian king and dragging stones around. But there's a psychological sense in which the mentality of this country is very much subjugated to an American mentality that has similar aspects to it. Because and I think that you really can flesh this out a bit more by recognizing that Paro, the king of Egypt, wasn't simply an enemy to the Hebrews. He started out as a friend, or at least the seat of the kingship of Mitzrayim, the throne, started out as a friend. And yeah, of course, they changed kings, right? And eventually you had one who didn't know Yosef and he became an enemy. But the Hebrews started off as a special protectorate of the king of Egypt and had a good relationship. And one shouldn't ignore the possibility that there are aspects of that special relationship that could be maintained even after the relationship sours and it becomes the case that Paro is trying to persecute and be cruel to Bnei Israel. That even in that cruelty, there's still a sense of, I am in charge of you, and you're my special people that started off as this sort of family of Yosef that had this special relationship to the crown, and you still are my special slave people, and I own you, and I decide what gets done with you, and you don't have autonomy to decide, how to do this and how to do that. There are various elements of this that come across in the text of the Torah itself, because as Paro gradually starts to let go and say, okay, you can go, there are these steps of, all right, the men can go, but you can't take the children with you, right? And then another plague. And then Paro says, okay, you can take the children, but you can't go and make sacrifices of these livestock that you're going to take with you. And there's this reluctance to simply say, okay, I'm uninvolved now. I'm not setting policy anymore. And Paro is always kind of trying to see if he can still be assertive in setting policy to some degree because of perhaps some sense of involvement and relationship and responsibility. And certainly America deals that way with Israel. And obviously America has a very complicated relationship with Israel because America regards itself as Israel's friend and ally. And certainly compared with any other country in the world, there are things that are true about that. And one ought to acknowledge that. And yet at the same time, it's also true that America has tied Israel's hands now for decades uh, in the way that it has applied pressure. And no one bears more responsibility for this than Israeli leaders who have accepted this. So I don't want to say it's all America's fault. Clearly, the leaders who gave us things like Oslo and the leaders who gave us things like the withdrawal from Gaza and who gave us things like the withdrawal from Lebanon and the disastrous end of the first the disastrous end of the war in southern Lebanon in 2006, which led to Hezbollah's buildup since then. All these different things, no one bears more responsibility for these things than Israel, the Israeli people, Israeli leaders, etc. And yet, it's also been the case that when Israeli leaders have made those horrible decisions, they have done so under tremendous pressure from the United States and with lots of hand-holding, let's say, and guidance towards the wrong decision that's come from a series of American leaders, from Jimmy Carter down through Bill Clinton, et cetera, who are always setting a policy that tells Israel, you're not allowed to fight the war that you need to fight. And that's why you have to make a different decision about what the solution to this situation is. And then the decision keeps getting made in a way that ultimately leads to a lot of Jews being slaughtered, right? So this is the part where it does start to really parallel the life and death aspect of Pharaoh's cruelty to Bnei Israel in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, because this idea of, oh, the people, are becoming too sort of ornery, too numerous and strong. We have to get rid of the males, right? So first, maybe the midwives, can kill off the males when they're born, or no, that's not working. So we have to throw them in the Nile. Obviously, this is about archetypes and not, or it can be about archetypes and not only about actual biological males and females. It's about stamping out masculinity in some sense. And masculinity obviously correlates with aggression, it correlates with expression of physical force. And obviously that's a generalization that we associated with the archetypes of different sexes. And so it's not that it can't be the case that either an individual man or woman could be one way or another. But archetypally, getting rid of the males is about getting rid of the strength to fight, right? And the will to dominate or the will to conquer and all of these things that Israel has had eaten out of it, partly by American policy over the course of decades, where it's always been about anytime Israel shows too much military strength, it's always, oh, that's disproportionate. Don't go overboard. You're indiscriminately bombing. You're being brutal in the way that you're dealing with your enemies, and we are no longer comfortable, with your being our ally if you act that way. And of course, being our ally is so valuable that you have to tone it down. You have to be more gentle, and so there's been this love-hate thing where America loves Israel, but America wants Israel to be meeker and less threatening to its enemies, less capable of fighting independently, all of these things that parallel the magnification of a feminine archetype. And so that parallels very much this thing with Paro trying to get rid of the males amongst the Hebrews, right? And that policy has actually been literally deadly for Am Yisrael, for the Jews. It's not just the case that it all is sort of metaphorically parallel to what Paro did. Paro was literally saying, throw the boys in the Nile. So maybe Americans are not saying to Israel, throw your male children into some river. But in practice, it is the case that our soldiers and our more vulnerable people have been slaughtered in greater numbers because Israel has over time become more and more beholden to an American policy that requires cooperation with the PA, that requires appeasement and some kind of calculus of partial deterrence, with vicious enemies like Hamas and Hezbollah. And then that leads to uh, certainly, for a long time, for decades, the quote unquote pinpricks of constant terror attacks where Jews are murdered. And everyone treated that for a long time, or not everyone, I should say, but everyone in the American government and most leaders in the Israeli government treated that like bad weather about which nothing could really be done. And then we finally kicked off the war that we're fighting right now with the same thing happening on a tremendously greater scale. And people finally have to some degree woken up to the fact that that death by 1,000 cuts eventually just leads to amplification and the slide down the slippery slope to doom. And now we have to face the fact that we have to act a different way. We have to fight our enemies a different way. And we have to be free from the domination of the American policy that has constantly been pressuring Israel over the course of decades to operate this way to its detriment. And so that's the kind of notion of Yetziat Mitzrayim that I'm interested in here, the notion of the liberation that's needed, that in that view, America is to Israel a kind of paro, and we are still in the mentality of, and therefore in a kind of a spiritual state of being in Egypt, being stuck, enslaved to paro, and we still have to get our heads out of that and get our national consciousness in a different frame. And from that realization, we can go to understanding what the significance of Korban Pesach is, what the significance of the Paschal offering is, because what we now can learn is what is it specifically that we're being asked to do in the Paschal offering, and how does that translate into the present day in lighting the way to what it means for us to pull free from Paro, to get away from American dominance in determination of our security and military and foreign policy. So I think in the end, the point there is a fairly simple one. What is Korban Pesach? You slaughter a lamb, a seh, and you take, in the instance of Korban Pesach b'Mitzrayim, right, when you're in Egypt, what was that? What does the form of that offering consist of? You're in Mitzrayim, you slaughter the lamb, you take the blood of that lamb, and you're painting it on your doorposts, right, and on the lintel of your door, but all around your doorway. So there are different elements that we can understand there. And also there's the Ezov, the Hyssop we mentioned before. So there are a few different elements to understand here. One of them is clearly that the lamb is the most gentle and innocent and harmless creature, seemingly. And that's being slaughtered by Bnei Israel because it is a mitzvah, because it is a commandment by Hashem that this is what you do. And what that is requiring of Bnei Israel is not just that they are slaughtering a lamb and showing Hashem that they will do that because Hashem commanded it, but also remember, it's a blasphemy, it's a defilement in the eyes of the Mitzrayim. It's a defilement of their gods. It's a rejection of their ideological system, right? It's smashing their idols, so to speak. So, well, why does that sound familiar? The idea of being willing to slaughter an innocent lamb because it's a commandment of Hashem, and to show to your oppressor that you pay no respect to his gods and that you're willing to blaspheme according to his standards. That is what we've already been talking about in terms of defining our conduct in warfare, right? The whole discourse around this war coming from America is you can't hurt a head or on the head of the tremendous majority of completely innocent civilians that you have to fight amongst. And so you have to tie all your hands and feet behind your back while you're fighting, put your own soldiers at risk, dramatically increase your casualties, dramatically reduce the enemy's casualties, prevent yourself from being able to fight the war to completion, prevent yourself from being able to deter the enemy, to drive the enemy away. All these things that are, 101, like how you actually achieve total victory in a war in the Middle East. You're not allowed to do any of those things, even if it's commanded according to the Torah. And that's the thing that we have to realize is that if it is a mitzvah to fight the war a certain way, then that is what Bnei Israel should be doing. And that's the case even if it requires doing something that is not appealing from this. It's not, the idea of slaughtering a lamb is not something to a person who has an inclination to gentleness, who has an inclination to making peace, who has an inclination to kindness, etc. Perhaps eating lamb, maybe, in the case of a lamb, can be enjoyable, but the slaughtering of a lamb presumably is not something that you take pleasure in. But if Akadosh Baruch Hu is commanding it, right? If it's part of his Torah that in this instance, in this situation, doing that which is distasteful is actually required because it's the right thing, it's the way you serve God in this instance, then you do it, right? And that translating to conduct of war would be to say, look, it may not be enjoyable for anyone to fight a war in a way that leads people who aren't at this exact moment running towards you with a weapon to be in harm's way, but that's how you win a war, and that's distasteful. And if it's the right thing to fight the war and win it, according to the Torah, which it is, then you do that. And you gladly do it insofar as you are accomplishing the commandment of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even if there's some aspect of it that isn't pretty or that is distasteful. And moreover, you do it dafka, on purpose, to make a point as well to the oppressor, meaning that Israel right now, to whatever degree it wants to throw Pharaohs' chains off its back, the way to do that would be to say, you are trying to tie our hands and make us send our sons to the slaughter, right? That's what Paro does to Bnei Israel. And what we're going to do instead is say, we're going to keep the Torah, and according to the mitzvot that we've been given by Hashem, we're going to be willing to shed the blood of quote-unquote innocence, which is represented by the lamb, in the course of conducting warfare properly according to the Torah, and we'll do that as a defilement of your false gods, right? This is what Israel needs to be saying to America. This is what it should be doing. And that is not just about, let's say, a way of conducting war to make war successful in and of itself. It's also perhaps even more so, because this is what's emphasized by the Lamb. It's about the importance of the symbolic gesture, the public demonstration of loyalty to Hashem and defilement of the false gods of the oppressor who is tying your hands and making you slaughter your own sons. And that in the merit of that turn towards Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu then is willing to bring his hand into the equation and set us free. Not only that, but I think also we can see in the involvement of the Ezov, the hyssop that is used to paint the blood on the door. When we learn elsewhere in Tanakh, hyssop is not mentioned very many places. One of the places it's mentioned is about how Shlomo HaMelech, who was the wisest of the wise, King Solomon, knew everything there was to know about plants and animals, and it mentions that he knows about Ezov, Asher Yotze Bakir, that it is the plant that grows out of the wall. So what it means to put hyssop on your doorway is to say, this is a wall, right? The doorway of the Judaic home has become a wall. It separates the interior of the home from the rest of the world. And so it is even more so about saying, look, there was an open connection. We were part of the same society, but in order to be free from your oppression, there has to be a willingness to step apart and say, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu requires me to do this, if this is a mitzvah that I'm doing to serve him, then I will let it become a wall between our society and your society. And so I will defile your gods, but I'll also do that understanding that this is really about separation and disconnection and a move to independence that reduces my access to your society, which is part of the reason, right, that this hasn't happened yet. It's been so important for Israel over the last stretch of its history to maintain this relationship with America, not just out of some kind of fear that America has power, that it will strike us with its fist, so to speak, if we don't obey it, but also because of all the benefits of that open connection, right? That there's so much wealth that one has the opportunity to participate in creating if you're doing things according to the mores set by the foreign gods. And then you have the door open and money can change hands and there can be all these shared institutions. And there even can also be the appearance of all of these benefits that extend to security, right? Because we look at something like Iron Dome and say, well, look, America gives us all this money to help pay for Iron Dome. And isn't that great? Because it makes us safe. And obviously you have to wait for the other foot to drop and say, well, but isn't it kind of the case that Iron Dome really is something America's paying for so that we won't fight back? Like if we didn't have it, then we wouldn't tolerate the rockets falling on us, and then we would have fought back a lot sooner. And this has really been the story with, much of America's military quote unquote help, is that it's really been designed to entrench Israel in a unresolvable situation that is this assemblage of band-aids, so to speak, where you don't actually fix problems, you just ameliorate their short-term consequences using money and technology. And that becomes a stronger political excuse not to actually fight back when people attack you. And that's, the buildup that we've been in for the last 20 years or so. More than that, really. And we now are living with some of the explosive consequences of that mistake. So may it be the case, Bezrat Hashem soon, that Bnei Israel realize as a whole, that the nation of Israel realizes as a whole, not just the people who probably mostly already get this, but also our leaders, whether it's because of tshuva in the hearts of our current leaders, or because Bezrat Hashem soon we get new leaders who are more aware of what is right and more aware of what the Torah teaches us about what is right, and more aware of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's promise to be with us and to make us successful if we keep his Torah and turn to him instead of turning to foreign powers, right? If we have those leaders, then we will have the strength and the determination to turn to the Americans and say, if you ask of us to sacrifice our own children so that we can protect the enemy that has been constantly preparing to strike and destroy us as a whole society for decades, then you're not our friend. You're our oppressor. And the way that we will answer you is by defiling your false gods and showing that we're willing to fight the war according to Hashem's Torah, and that we regard it as a mitzvah to sacrifice the lamb and paint the blood on the door and make a demonstration of our loyalty to him and our disloyalty to Paro and his idols.